So I'll try to speak slow for the simultaneous translation, I hope. And if there's any questions from anything I say, everyone's welcome to ask them during the Q&A period. So today we're going to talk about recent excavations of Buddhist manuscripts from the area of Greater Gandhara and what, if anything, we can sort of extract from this in terms of meditation practices in the area. Now you might be asking, what is Greater Gandhara? So this is the historic area that is now occupied by Afghanistan, parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, northern India, which is now Jammu and Kashmir. These sites, of course, are, you might think of sort of Islamic influences, which is certainly the case today, but historically, these were all very strong Buddhist communities flourished in this area until around the 10th century. There are some important sites like Gilgit and Mezainak, which is a site that we'll talk about today. And this area, in the 1930s, manuscripts were discovered here in Pakistan, in Gilgit, in what was sort of a dilapidated tower, or originally was thought to be a stupa, but it seems to have been a tower with a small monastic community of around 5 monks. And there was a large cache of Buddhist manuscripts found here, several hundreds of different texts, thousands of manuscript leaves written on birch bark, the bark from the birch tree. So it seems it was a library that was maintained by a small monastic community for several hundred years, for at least 200 years. And these manuscripts, and since then, manuscripts from this area have been uncovered consistently since the 1990s in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Predominantly in Sanskrit, and in the 90s in another language called Gandhari, which was a Middle Indic Prakrit, which was used locally in the area until around the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. And that was written in a script called Kharoshthi, but the works we're talking about are in Sanskrit, sort of one of the ancient languages of Buddhist transmission. And they were written in 2 different scripts, Gilgit Bamiyan Type 1 here and Gilgit Bamiyan Type 2 here. Type 1 was used almost exclusively for Mahayana sutras. And Type 2 was used almost exclusively for Shravakayana sutras. And very briefly, the difference between the Mahayana and the Shravakayana is the Mahayana takes the goal of Buddhahood as primary, so everyone can strive to be a Buddha, whereas the Shravakayana, the vehicle of the hearers, the goal is freedom from samsara, liberation, awakening, and you would become an arhat, because there can only be one Buddha at a time. Shakyamuni, Gautama Buddha is the Buddha in our Lokadhatu, our universe. And he, of course, is no longer of this world. So to become a Buddha, one has to wait until one can be born in another Lokadhatu or at another time in this Lokadhatu. The next Buddha, of course, being Maitreya. So it takes a very long time to become a Buddha, and the Mahayana is maybe considered more difficult by some people. And of course, Mahayana Buddhism is what is spread across East Asia and the Himalayan region. So in Korea today, all of the Buddhist schools are Mahayana in nature. And the Shravakayana remained in the Indian subcontinent and is extant today in the Theravada school, which is the last remaining school of the Shravakayana. In the area of Greater Gandhara, we have various people passing through historically. Most famous is, of course, Xuanzang, who around the time that the manuscripts that we're talking about passed through Gandhara, on his way to Nalanda, the great monastic university in India, where he stayed for 10 years. And he notes that the people in Bamiyan, which is a city in Gandhara, the minds of the people are of pure faith and is far better than that of the people in neighboring countries. He describes the giant Buddhas of Bamiyan, which we'll discuss in a little bit, which had only recently been completed and were covered in jewels. And throughout the area of Greater Gandhara, he reports that places are variously well represented by Buddhism or in decline from location to location. In Kapishi, for example, there are over 100 monasteries which were mostly following the Mahayana. But in Gandhara proper, which was now under the rule of Kapishi, the location was sparsely populated and most followed heretical religions, with Buddhism mostly supplanted. So we see that even in the 7th century, there's already kind of a decline, a slow decline of Buddhism. It's kind of a study in contrast, because Buddhism was thriving, the Buddhas of Bamiyan had recently been completed, but already beginning to be supplanted, and by the 10th century, this is complete and Buddhism is no longer practiced in the area, well, very sparsely until maybe, the 11th century, but there's not much evidence past the 10th century. But Gandhara is a very important site for the spread of Buddhism because it was sort of the nexus of the Silk Road where Buddhism spread out of the Indian subcontinent and east and west. So here we see, for example, the pensive bodhisattva pose in a Gandharan sculpture. This is from the 1st or 2nd century. And these sort of art historical developments spread across the Silk Road east all the way to Korea and later Japan. And here we see, of course, the very famous Mahayana Bodhisattva Maitreya, probably Maitreya, which is now in the National Museum, and its twin or sort of later duplicate, which is currently in Japan. And as these ideas spread across the Silk Road, you also see not just statues, but texts themselves. So Buddhist manuscripts were spread from India into Gandhara or created in Gandhara and spread east from there. Xuanzang himself brought back many manuscripts to China. And you see the scripts themselves, these Gilgit Bamiyan type scripts, are passed along to the east as well. Here we see a Heart Sutra in Siddhamatrika, which is sort of an evolution of Gilgit Bamiyan type 2, Proto-Sharada, which was found in Horyuchi in Japan, supposedly from the 6th century, but this was probably copied several centuries later. And here we see a similar Siddhamatrika manuscript of the Heart Sutra, which is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, but it's also from Japan originally. This is the same script that these manuscripts in Gandhara were copied in, one of the scripts. And ideas also spread west, not just east, along the Silk Road. So just a couple years ago, there was a fabulous discovery in Berenike in Egypt, where a Buddha statue, very likely Amitabha, was discovered in a port city in Egypt, which was part of the Roman Empire at the time, as well as a Sanskrit inscription. And it was created in local marble, actually. So you see Buddhist ideas spreading from Gandhara, and it's in the Gandharan design. And the whole statue is standing in the Abhaya Mudra standing, so it's probably an Amitabha. So it's very interesting to see these Buddhist ideas spread from this area of Greater Gandhara all over the world, all over the ancient world. Here, of course, is the famous Bamiyan Buddha, one of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, the area of Greater Gandhara, which was the largest freestanding statue in the world until it was destroyed in 2001, unfortunately. So this is a whole monastic complex, and this is in Bamiyan, in Greater Gandhara, where Buddhism was very, very strong, and its remnants remained until into the modern era. Unfortunately, the Taliban destroyed this in 2001, not long before they sort of fell out of power due to other geopolitical incidents. And even here in Bamiyan, there were manuscripts discovered Buddhist manuscripts. Unfortunately, it's fragments because when the statues were destroyed, everything inside was also destroyed. But there still were fragments uncovered, and they've undergone chemical analysis in Japan, actually. And now we're fortunately in the states where we can, instead of destroying Buddhist heritage in Gandhara, it's now being preserved. So right now I'm leading a project where we're preserving manuscript material uncovered in Afghanistan and materials from Afghanistan that have spread to other locations. Like here's a large collection in Bangkok, for example. And here's the site of Mezainak, which is an archaeological site 40 kilometers from Kabul. And it was an ancient city that was inhabited from the Bronze Era up until around the 7th, 8th, 9th century. It has fabulous archaeological finds have been here. So here's a Buddha image recovered from the site. It had been excavated in 2012 by UNESCO, and then another excavation in 2018 by the Archaeological Institute of Afghanistan, who I'm working with today. Pardon me. And this site is on the largest copper deposit in the world. So the ancient city was always associated with copper. In fact, Mezainak itself means little copper site, which is a bit of a misnomer because it's the largest copper deposit in the world. But this also, it led to wealth and trade in the area historically, but it has also led to some issues with preservation today because, copper is still an important resource. And there are plans to mine the site. During the previous government in Afghanistan, the US-backed government, the Chinese government made a multi-billion-dollar deal to begin open pit mining at Mezainak, which would have destroyed the site entirely. Fortunately, this hasn't happened due to sort of the political instability in the area. The mining never got started. And now that with the new government, the Taliban government, the Chinese government has still offered the same terms as they offered the previous government to mine the site. And plans are underway to mine the site, but I'm happy to report that it won't be open pit mining now. It should be underground mining, which hopefully will save the material that hasn't been excavated yet. It's a whole city of not just Buddhist sites, but Zoroastrian sites we see here, various temples. It was a very cosmopolitan site. And it was also not just a monastic complex. There certainly were Buddhist temples here, but it was also a city where people lived, sort of almost like Seoul, where you would see, temples in the center of the city. It's very similar, or would have been very similar. And what you can see in Site 1 and Site 2, this is one of the sites where Buddhist manuscripts have been uncovered. And we also see Zoroastrian sites in 3 and 5, which is Zoroastrianism is another ancient religion of the area, sort of a native religion of this part of the world, which is still practiced today, but not very widely in the Persian community and its diaspora. The manuscript sites were possibly local storage or administration rooms, possibly belonging to some sort of Buddhist community, maybe a monastic complex, but maybe just a small sort of enclave where monks were living. But what's really interesting about this site is where the Buddhist manuscripts were found. There was also a Bactrian document, and here's a Bactrian document that was translated by Nicholas Sims Williams in London. And we see it seems to have been a contract or a receipt, because we see the number 2, which is written twice as a numeral and as a number, as a written number, the word 2, and the word drachma, which is a currency. So this certainly suggests that it was a business contract or receipt. So this is a very nice example of sort of Buddhist communities engaging in daily life, but also keeping, sacred documents in the same site. And this had never been found conclusively. Always in the past, you would see Bactrian documents coming to light around the same time as Buddhist documents. But because of the situation in Afghanistan, manuscripts are very rarely excavated in a sort of professional way. In the last decades, they just sort of appear randomly. Someone finds them and then they sell them to somebody, and then they sort of end up in Europe or in Asia at museums or in private collections. So what's fascinating about Mezainak is it's a site where we can see these manuscripts in situ, uncovered, know exactly where they were uncovered in the geographical area, which is very rare. It's been an ambiguous sort of period, of course, for preservation in Afghanistan. With the new government shift in 2021, we saw some examples of historic sites being bulldozed during sort of the confusion of the regime change. But the government has sort of clamped down on this, and sites are protected. The Taliban government has released a statement saying that they support cultural heritage and they will not allow sites to be destroyed. And they really are supporting the preservation of this material. So this is, quite almost a very hopeful time, an optimistic time, and it's becoming more easier at least, to sort of logistical problems aside, to do excavations. So we have a team now in Afghanistan of archaeologists at the Archaeological Institute of Afghanistan who I'm working with. And we're excavating material and digitizing material, preserving material. We have a lab here in Kabul, and this is manuscripts. You can see here manuscript material uncovered that are being cleaned by the team. A really nice multi-ethnic team of Pashtun, Hazara, Tajik, and Uzbek archaeologists all working together. So it's really nice that we can sort of support local communities through the study of Buddhist material and the preservation of Buddhist material of sort of cultural and historical importance. Here's some members of the team sifting through small manuscript fragments, and here's a member cleaning a fragment. You can see these manuscripts are very small. They're, you can hold them in the palm of your hand. This is sort of the equivalent of a book today. They were copied in very small handwriting and kept in collections. So if you see a picture of these manuscripts, they might look bigger, but they're actually very small. Most of the manuscripts uncovered have been in Gilgit-Bamiyan Type 1, which is the earlier scripts dating from the 5th to 6th centuries. There's also Gilgit-Bamiyan Type 2 fragments, which date from the 6th and 7th centuries, or 7th and 8th century, rather. And as I said earlier, Gilgit-Bamiyan Type 1, or sort of Gandharan Brahmi or round Gupta Brahmi, were used primarily for Mahayana works like sutras, and Type 2 was used for mainly Shravakayana works, but this is not always the case. You do see some Mahayana sutras in Type 2 or Proto-Sharda, which became Siddhamatrika, which spread all the way to East Asia. And even in temples in Korea today, you can see Sanskrit characters written in the Siddhamatrika script. So this is the script. If you go to a temple in Seoul, you might see it on the wall. And this is the same script that originated here in Gandhara. So a lot of the material is very fragmentary, and what we have to do is clean each piece, photograph it, and then it can be put back together digitally, but it will take a very long time. So this work will take many years, over many decades. Here's a picture of some larger fragments being digitized. So first you try to clean them, and then you digitize them. And the material that, after you photograph it, it should be preserved in a safe location in various areas. And once photographed, we can put this online for the public to see, which is something that we'll be doing in the coming years. So you can actually look at this material yourself on the web eventually. So here we see a manuscript bundle in situ, in the ground, so you can see exactly where it was uncovered. And I've read these to be at least two works at the moment, the Maitreya Vyakarana and Buddha Avadana verses, probably together this probably makes the Shuddhika Pitaka, sort of the miscellaneous Pitaka of the Mula Sarvastivada Agamas. The Sarvastivadins were a Buddhist school, a Shravakayana school. Their Vinaya survives today. Their sort of Vinaya monastic rules as practiced in the Himalayan and Tibetan regions. So Tibetan Buddhism follows the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, whereas of course Chinese Buddhist manifestations and Korean Buddhist manifestations follow the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya. Maitreya Vyakarana was a work of some sort of ambiguity in terms of its what kind of Buddhist work it was. Was it Shravakayana? Was it Mahayana? It's recorded as a Mahayana Sutra in Nepalese transmissions. But of course, the content is not a Mahayana Sutra at all. It's a mainstream Buddhist work about Maitreya when he comes as the next Buddha, what will the world be like? It is not extant in every Tibetan kanjur, so there was some ambiguity as to whether this was considered Buddha Vachana, or the words of the Buddha. So for a Buddhist sutra or text to be considered canonical, it must be agreed that it was, spoken by the Buddha himself, whether it's a Shravakayana work or a Mahayana work, if the community accepts this designation. And the Maitreya Vyakarana, it seems, perhaps was not accepted as a being spoken by the Buddha, by the Mula Sarvastivadins, which is why it would have been in this Shuddhika Pitaka, miscellaneous basket, which was not considered canonical by the Mula Sarvastivadin community. You have a Khuddaka Nikaya that is transmitted by the Theravadins, which is considered canonical, and in this you have works like the Dhammapada, for example, and then certain Jatakas and Avadanas and things like this. What's interesting about this bundle is you can see it was copied by the same scribe. So different scribes copied these works, and you can see this is a ta, and the scribe who made this had a certain style of slanting his tas. So you can identify that one scribe wrote these bundles with two different works. This work is also attested in the Bezeklik caves in Central Asia, in Turfan, these Bahubuddha Avadana verses. And here's an example of the translation of the Bahubuddha Avadana verses, which are about the Buddha Gautama's experiences meeting other Buddhas before he himself was a Buddha. But I won't get into this too deeply. And you see here we have a sort of rosette or a floral embellishment. And it's an early example of these sort of floral embellishments that become sort of much more intricate in Gandharan works later in the type 2 scripts. So this is the end of the Dirghagama and the long discourses of the Buddha, and this is the end of the Vinaya Vastu Agama, which is the collection of monastic law works, which become quite intricate and made with a compass. And here's this rosette at Mezainak. And you can see similar ones in the Gilgit finds, and this is a usual colophon marker, which is just 2 circles. And these, of course, become much more sort of elaborate in later Buddhist works. Here's an 11th century Dharani Sangraha in the Los Angeles Museum of Art. And here's an Ashtasasukha Prajnaparamita, or the Perfection of Insight, in 8,000 lines, also from the 11th century, where you see very similar sort of compass-made rosettes. And you also see early works with these elaborate rosettes. Here's the Dashabhumika Sutra, which was composed somewhere in the region of North India, but is now in Nepal. And these works would have had ink coloring them, various pigments, like orpiment, I believe it's called. The manuscripts by Gandhara, these colors have been wiped away at this point because they've been they were underground, under the dirt for many hundreds of years, as opposed to sitting in a monastic library, which is where the Dashabhumika Sutra was. And now it's in the National Archives in Kathmandu. And these rosettes seem to have come from the area of Greater Gandhara. In Afghanistan, we see very similar sort of floral designs being used in pottery. And we see petroglyphs in Pakistan, in the sort of Chilas area, which are also very similar. Here's a stupa. Interestingly, manuscripts from Gandhara never have figures in these embellishments. But here in Central Asia, an early work of the larger Prajnaparamita, you do see a figure. So it seems the idea of illuminations figures perhaps spread into India itself from Central Asia, but it's not clear yet. And even in Dunhuang in Central Asia, a famous site for manuscripts uncovered most in Tibetan and Chinese, you see the same designs being used. Here's one in an Arya Avalokiteshvara Ekadashamukha Dharani, which is the same design as we see at the end of the Vinaya Vastu Agamas. So there was a lot of trade between Gandhara along the Silk Road into Central Asia and then into East Asia. And we even see manuscripts from Gandhara in Central Asia. Here's a Prajnaparamita, Perfection of Insight, that is found in the Mogao cave complex in Dunhuang. But what's interesting about Gandharan manuscripts found outside of Gandhara, they're nearly always copied on palm leaf, whereas the manuscripts that are found within Gandhara, or the greater Gandhara, are found almost exclusively on birch bark. So were these copied outside of Gandhara? No, certainly not. It would be very unlikely that these works would be copied by a scribe who knows these scripts and is outside of Gandhara. But why on palm leaf? This is something that's not clear at the moment. So what have we been finding in this area in these newly uncovered works? Well, here, for example, is an esoteric text, a tantra. It appears to have a colophon dating this the Kala Chakra Tantra, but this would make it 300 years earlier than the accepted origin of this work. So this is perhaps an exciting development, but you can see it quite clearly here, Kala Chakra. So, and you see this is copied in the Gilgit-Bamiyan type 2 script. So this would have been a Mahayana work, but it's not a sutra, it's a tantra, and it is copied in this later script, which was used predominantly for non-Mahayana works. Here we see the Lotus Sutra when it's under excavation and now sitting in the National Museum in Kabul. It's a bundle of the Lotus Sutra, but it's sort of still encased in dirt, and it has to be slowly conserved and separated, but this will take some time. But you can see mentions of meditation in these texts, clear mentions of meditation. So we see here the dhyana or the meditation jhana of reciting a sutra from the Lotus Sutra. We see a verse that says, upholding and causing this sutra to be recited, his faculty of mind is such that although one has not obtained knowledge of non-attachment, one has that which precedes it. So this is very important in Mahayana sutras, this concept of upholding. Here we have dari tva, and causing it to be recited or reciting in itself, vachi tva. So upholding is bearing it in mind. So Mahayana sutras have this quality of reading the sutra itself is a kind of meditation. Perhaps Professor Silk talked about this in his talk yesterday, which I unfortunately didn't see, I'm not sure. We see then the Blessed One addressed the Bodhisattva, the Mahasattva, Mahastama Prapta, the Bodhisattva, one of the Bodhisattvas who's always flanking Amitabha, along with, of course, Avalokiteshvara. Therefore, Mahastama Prapta, with this discourse, it is to be known in this way, namely, those who will reject the Dharma discourse of this kind, who will abuse and rebuke the upholders of the sutras of this kind, monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, and will address them with false and harsh speech. For them, there will be ominous consequences for which words are not able to relate. Those who will master a sutra of this kind, that which means to memorize it, will cause it to be upheld, recited, and taught, and will cause it to be extensively manifested to others. For them, there will accordingly be agreeable consequences of such a sort I have previously related. They will attain a purification of eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body, and mind of this kind. So it's very clear that, sort of diegetically stated, you should explicitly stated memorize these works. This is a sort of a classic hallmark of Mahayana Sutra literature. Reading the work itself is a meditation, a sutra recitation. Here's the Ashtasahasrika Pranya Paramita found at Mezainak. And what's very interesting about this work is this is the first perfection of insight in 8,000 lines, which is the earliest manifestation of the perfection of insight or perfection of wisdom. This is the first one found in the area of Greater Gandhara. There are others written in Gandhara that are earlier, or Brahmi that are earlier. And like those, this exhibits a very different transmission than what we see of this work in later Nepalese transmissions in Sanskrit and the Chinese translations and Tibetan translations. You would call it almost abbreviated, but it's not abbreviated because it's earlier. So the work was sort of extended and lengthened over the years. But when this manuscript was composed in Greater Gandhara, the work was not set yet. So it was waxing and waning in length. And it was transmitted at the same time as the larger Pranya Paramita, the Maha Pranya Paramita, variously in 25,000 lines, 100,000 lines. And here's another manuscript of this work, which is in the UK, another collection that we're working on in the project. And the Pranya Paramita itself also discusses this concept of meditation quite extensively, but it doesn't ever really explicitly state what the meditation practices you should do are. It's already known, but the concept of reading the sutra itself is the meditation, and then from the sutra you learn other meditations in a community that was reciting and transmitting the sutra. So here we see from this fragment a meditation on emptiness. One focuses one's attention upon all beings, so the Bodhisattva Mahasattva is one endowed with this mindful, focused attention, with this production of thought. Thus he is endowed with skillful means, upaya. He is one who has comprehended by the perfection of insight the true nature of these deep dharmas, contemplating in accordance with emptiness, causelessness, aimlessness, non-accumulation of karma, non-origination, non-rebirth, non-becoming. And moving on, what kind of characteristics and aspirations are to be undertaken so that a Bodhisattva Mahasattva does not realize emptiness. When these aspirations are undertaken, he is one who realizes causelessness, does not realize causelessness, does not realize aimlessness, does not realize non-accumulation of karma, does not realize non-origination, he does not realize non-birth, he does not realize non-becoming, but would cultivate the perfection of insight. So you do these, it recommends doing these deep meditations, samadhis, but not reaping the fruit, because to reap the fruit would to become a Buddha or not a Buddha, but an Arhat, to understand awakening, Bodhi, which would, of course, you wouldn't have any more births, but the goal of a Bodhisattva is to become a Buddha oneself. So you practice these meditations, but you want to get to the stage of non-retrogression, of Aivartika, and not find the ultimate goal yet. And this leads to a kind of meditation sickness I'd like to discuss in the Perfection of Insight, in the 24th chapter of the Perfection of Insight. This was the chapter of pride, Abhimana Parivarta. And it's of particular interest for practitioners of meditation. This chapter takes the form of a discourse between the Buddha Gautama and one of his foremost disciples, Ananda. The content of this discussion deals with the dangers of pride that can affect the Bodhisattva, as they have made an amount of progress in their spiritual meditative pursuits, but are still far from the goal. The perfection of insight in 8,000 lines, being concerned with the practice of successfully navigating the path to Buddhahood, acts as a sort of manual to bodhisattvas, telling them how to act and progress in this pursuit. Throughout the perfection of insight in 8,000 lines, and perfection of insight literature on the whole, the act of learning, memorizing, reciting, and writing the perfection of insight is taught as an imperative spiritual practice, a meditation in and of itself, and it can be seen as a fundamental type of meditative practice. We see this clearly in this chapter, where they describe that hearing or teaching the perfection of insight is only discussed in terms used to describe Buddhist meditation practices. In this chapter, we see bodhisattvas who have been training deeply in the perfection of insight, whose success in this activity begins to attract the attention of Mara, the god of illusion and temptation, drawing his ire. Mara plays on the bodhisattva's weaknesses by gaining influence over them and directing them towards vain pridefulness, viewing themselves as better than other Buddhists. This includes not only those who follow the mainstream Buddhist vehicles, the vehicles of the hearers, Shravakayana, which lead to becoming an arhat, and the vehicle of the solitary Buddhas, the Pratyeka Buddhayana, which leads to becoming a Pratyeka Buddha, a Buddha who doesn't teach. Their own colleagues on the long and extremely difficult road to awakening. Surprisingly, while Mara is evidently unable to influence bodhisattvas who have become irreversible of Ivartaniya or of Ivartika, and are no longer liable to sliding into negative births worse than the ones they have now, Mara is able to influence those who have had a prediction of their own Buddhahood in the distant future prophesied to them by a Buddha during a previous life in the distant past. Even, or perhaps especially, those who know they will eventually succeed in perfect awakening are susceptible to falling victim to their own opinion of themselves as they progress toward their goal, thus moving that goal even farther away. Within the cosmological understanding laid out in Buddhist traditions, a world system or universe, a loka dhatu, is made up of three realms of existence: the desire realm, the kama dhatu, the form realm, the rupa dhatu, and the formless realm, the arupa dhatu. Within these three realms, a number of realms exist concurrently, ranging from hells through to ghostly spheres of influence, the animal world and the human world, up to various heavenly realms. There are many world systems existing simultaneously and independent from one another, each with Buddhas, deities, and living beings residing in the various realms. Many deities and divine figures feature heavily within the Buddhist traditions and travel between these realms. Among them, Mara is portrayed as an antagonistic figure towards the Buddha and his Dharma. It was Mara who is famously portrayed as the one who actively attempted to stop the ascetic Siddhartha Gautama as he sat under the Bodhi tree from realizing perfect awakening to finally becoming the Buddha. Mara is somewhat of an ambiguous character within the Buddhist cosmology. While he is definitely portrayed as an existing divine being who actively attempted to thwart the Buddha and those who follow his teachings, he may also be simultaneously seen as what has been called a personification of subjective mental conditions. It is perhaps best to view the figure of Mara in both of these lights: an antagonistic figure of the Buddha and the Dharma, who is the cause and yet also the embodiment of negative mental states and hallucinations of what may be thought of today as psychological afflictions. In this case, Mara specifically embodies destructive narcissistic tendencies, which can arise when one makes progress in one's meditative and spiritual development without reflecting on being humble at the same time. We see this tension of Mara's role as both agent and result of illusion within the chapter in the perfection of insight. Mara is dismayed to see bodhisattvas progressing in their practice of the perfection of insight and gains influence over them, allowing negative mental states to appear to thwart both their own goals and even the spiritual progress of those who may be charmed by their words and become their students. The only way to free oneself from these states, the Buddha explains to Ananda, is to confess these negative mental states to the monastic community, to remorsefully reprimand oneself of these past actions, and to refocus oneself on the goal of omniscience, that is to say, Buddhahood itself, by striving to view others as if they are no different than their teacher, the Buddha themselves. And I think this wraps up my time for speaking. So I hope you can understand from this lecture that the Mahayana Sutras extol meditation through recitation of them themselves and warn not to get too prideful in one's meditation activities. This is a kind of meditation sickness. Thank you for your attention. I think there's some time for question and answers, and I will stop it here.
For this lecture, I had correct questions, okay? Yeah. Could you share one of your preferred the meditation techniques and explain how it has brought changes to your life?
Well, for me, of course, I think it's very important to hold the sutras in mind, Daritva, and recite them. This is a type of meditation. I also think a very useful meditation practice is Anuprana-smriti, mindfulness on the breath. I think through this one can enter shamatha and various dhyanas. And for me personally, this has been very helpful, as I'm sure it has for many others.
Thank you.